The sound of a gunshot echoed across the empty plains, sending a flock of startled birds into the air as Madeline Wright's last horse collapsed in a cloud of dust. She hadn't cried when the outlaws took her husband's life 3 days prior, nor when they burned her homestead to smoldering ash. But as she stood beside the empty wagon, her final possession in the world, a single tear carved a path through the dirt on her cheek. The year was 1876, and the promise of the Dakota Territory had turned to bitter dust in her mouth. At 22, Madeline found herself utterly alone, miles from the nearest settlement, with nothing but an empty wagon and the clothes on her back. Her chestnut hair, once neatly pinned, now hung in tangled waves around her face as she sat heavily on a rock beside the useless wagon, wondering if this was where her story would end. "Madam, that's a mighty fine wagon to be sitting empty." The voice startled her, and Madeline scrambled to her feet, reaching for the small derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt, the one thing the outlaws hadn't discovered. A tall figure on horseback approached through the haze of afternoon heat, his silhouette gradually taking form against the vast emptiness of the plains. "Stay back," she warned, her voice stronger than she felt. "I've nothing left worth taking." The rider slowed his approach, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. As he drew closer, Madeline could make out his features. A weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a day's worth of stubble along his jawline. "Name's Gabriel North, madam. I don't take from those who have already lost." He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more time in a saddle than on solid ground. "Heard the shot. Your horse?" Madeline nodded, the derringer still pointed in his direction. "Last one. The outlaws took the others when they raided my homestead." She swallowed hard. "And killed my husband." Gabriel removed his hat, holding it against his chest in a gesture of respect. "I'm right sorry to hear that." His eyes traveled to the empty wagon, then back to her face. "You'll fill it again with what you love," he said softly. "Life has a way of coming back around." "Easy words from a man who hasn't lost everything," she replied bitterly. A flash of something pain perhaps crossed his face. "You might be surprised, madam." He replaced his hat and gestured toward his horse. "Deadwood's a day's ride north. My horse can carry us both that far, unless you prefer to sit beside that empty wagon until the elements claim you too." Madeline hesitated, the derringer wavering in her hand. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but neither was pride when faced with certain death on the plains. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked. Gabriel's mouth curved into a slight smile. "Because once upon a time someone helped me when I had nothing but an empty saddle and a bullet in my shoulder." He extended his hand. "Sometimes kindness is the only thing that makes sense in this God-forsaken territory." With a deep breath, Madeline lowered the gun and took his hand. His palm was calloused but warm against her skin, and for the first time in days she felt something other than despair. "I can't leave the wagon," she said. "It's all I have left." Gabriel considered the vehicle for a moment. "We'll fashion a harness. My horse can pull it slow. Might take us longer to reach town, but you'll arrive with your possessions intact." He paused, limited as they may be at present. As they worked together to create a makeshift harness from leather straps and rope from Gabriel's saddlebags, Madeline found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. There was something in the way he moved, purposeful, methodical, that reminded her of her father. A man of few words but steady action. "You're handy with knots," she observed as he secured the last of the harness. 5 years at sea before I came west," he explained. "Learned more about ropes than any man should rightly know." "What brought you to the Dakota Territory?" His hand stilled for just a moment. "Same thing that brings most folks out here, a fresh start." He finished the knot with a sharp tug. "And you, what brought a woman like you to this unforgiving place?" "My husband's dreams," Madeline answered honestly. "Thomas believed we could build something here, a cattle ranch that would grow with the territory." She looked around at the endless expanse of prairie grass. "Now it's just me and an empty wagon." Gabriel tested the harness, ensuring it would hold. "Dreams don't die with the dreamer, Mrs. Wright. They just find new keepers." He helped her onto the wagon seat and then mounted his horse. "We should move. I'd like to make 10 miles before nightfall." As they began their slow journey north, the vast Dakota sky spread above them like an endless ocean, clouds drifting like distant ships. Madeline found herself studying Gabriel's straight back as he rode ahead of the wagon, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was following. Who was this stranger who spoke of dreams with such quiet certainty? The sun was beginning its descent when Gabriel signaled for them to stop near a small creek. "We'll camp here for the night," he announced. "Water for the horse, shelter from the wind in those trees." Madeline climbed down stiffly from the wagon seat, her muscles protesting after hours of sitting. "I've nothing to offer for supper," she said, embarrassment coloring her voice. "I've jerky and hardtack," Gabriel replied, untethering his horse from the wagon. "Not a feast, but it'll keep body and soul together." He handed her the reins. "Would you water him while I gather wood for a fire?" "His name's Samson." The horse nudged Madeline's shoulder as if in greeting, and she found herself smiling despite everything. "Hello, Samson. Thank you for pulling my empty wagon today." She stroked his velvety nose, drawing comfort from the simple contact with another living being. As dusk settled around them, Gabriel built a small fire, its flames casting dancing shadows across their makeshift camp. They sat in companionable silence, chewing the tough jerky and washing it down with water from the creek. "Tomorrow we'll reach Deadwood," Gabriel said eventually. "It's a rough town, but there's work to be found if you're not particular about what kind." "What will I do there?" Madeline asked, the question more for herself than him. "I was a rancher's wife, before that a farmer's daughter. I know cattle and crops, not whatever passes for civilization in a mining town." Gabriel poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "What are you good at, Mrs. Wright?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that before, not her father, who'd arranged her marriage to Thomas, nor Thomas himself, who'd simply expected her to adapt to whatever life demanded. "I can sew," she said finally. "Not just mending, but creating. I made all my own dresses and Thomas's shirts." She paused, remembering, "And I can cook. My mother taught me everything she knew before consumption took her." Gabriel nodded thoughtfully. "Deadwood's full of miners and gamblers who'll pay good money for a decent meal and clothes that don't fall apart at first wearing." He glanced at her. "You could start there." "With what? I have no fabric, no supplies, no," her voice caught. "No nothing. You have a wagon," Gabriel reminded her gently. "And tomorrow you'll have possibilities, that's more than some." He stood, brushing off his pants. "Get some rest, Mrs. Wright." "I'll take first watch." "First watch," she echoed. "We're still in Dakota Territory," he explained, "and there are outlaws aplenty. I'll wake you in a few hours to take your turn." Madeline wanted to argue that she knew nothing about keeping watch, but the exhaustion of the past days crashed over her like a wave. She nodded weakly and made her way to the wagon, where she curled beneath the single blanket Gabriel had provided from his saddlebags. As sleep began to claim her, she heard the soft sound of Gabriel humming a tune she didn't recognize. It was a melancholy melody, carrying notes of longing and loss that resonated with her own grief. In that moment, she realized she'd never asked him his story, what had brought him to this lonely stretch of prairie just when she needed someone most. Tomorrow, she decided as consciousness faded. Tomorrow she would ask. Morning arrived with a chill that cut through Madeline's thin clothes. She had taken her turn at watch as promised, sitting upright and alert despite her fear, clutching the derringer like a talisman against the unknown dangers of the night. Gabriel had slept nearby, his breathing steady and his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. Now, as pale light spread across the eastern horizon, she found him already awake, tending to Samson and preparing for their departure. "You should have woken me sooner," she said, approaching him with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You needed the rest," he replied simply. "There's coffee if you want it." The tin cup he offered contained a dark liquid that bore only a passing resemblance to coffee, but it was hot and strong enough to chase away the morning cold. Madeline sipped it gratefully, watching as Gabriel efficiently broke down their camp, leaving almost no trace of their presence. "You move like a man used to disappearing," she observed. His hands paused briefly in their work. "Sometimes disappearing is the only way to stay alive." He secured his bedroll behind his saddle. "We should reach Deadwood by midday if we make good time." As they continued their journey, the landscape began to change, rolling plains giving way to more rugged terrain. In the distance, the dark smudge of the Black Hills loomed against the horizon, a forbidden territory that had drawn prospectors and adventurers despite treaties promising the land to the Lakota people. "Is it true?" Madeline asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "About the gold in those hills," Gabriel's expression darkened. "True enough to make men kill for it. The government signed those hills away to the Lakota, then broke their word when gold was discovered." He shook his head. "Now there's a war brewing that neither side can truly win." "And yet you're heading toward Deadwood." "I've no interest in gold," he said, "just passing through on my way north to Montana Territory." "Then why help me?" Madeline pressed. "I'm slowing your journey." Gabriel was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, 3 years ago I lost my wife and daughter to cholera in Kansas. I was away, driving cattle north when it swept through our settlement." His voice remained steady, but Madeline could hear the undercurrent of pain. "By the time I returned, they were both in the ground, and everything we'd built together was being picked over by neighbors." "I'm so sorry," Madeline whispered. "I rode away with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back," he continued. "Would have likely drunk myself to death if an old Pawnee man hadn't found me half frozen in a blizzard." His eyes met hers briefly. "He told me that empty spaces get filled again one way or another. It's up to us whether we fill them with bitterness or something better." The words settled over Madeline like a mantle. "And have you filled those empty spaces?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Still working on it, but I reckon helping you is better than letting bitterness take root." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet, reflective rather than strained. Madeline found herself studying the back of Gabriel's neck, where his hat didn't quite cover his sun-browned skin, wondering about the man who had lost as much as she had but still found reason to extend kindness to a stranger. As Gabriel had predicted, the outskirts of Deadwood came into view shortly after midday. The town had sprung up virtually overnight in the gulch where gold had first been discovered, with no proper planning or organization. Buildings of varying quality lined the muddy main street, from crude tents to more substantial structures of raw lumber. The air was thick with the sounds of construction, the shouts of teamsters, and the general bustle of a boom town. Madeline felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. This chaotic assemblage of humanity was as far from her quiet homestead as could be imagined. How would she possibly make her way here? Gabriel seemed to sense her unease. "It looks worse than it is," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "There are decent folks mixed in with the rest." They made their way slowly down the main street, drawing curious glances from passers-by. An empty wagon pulled by a single horse, a woman in travel-stained clothes, and a man who looked more rangeland than mining camp made an unusual sight even in Deadwood. Gabriel directed them toward a small livery stable at the edge of town. "We'll stable Samson here while we find you a place to stay," he said as he helped Madeline down from the wagon. The liveryman, a grizzled old-timer with only one good eye, looked them over critically. "2 bits for the horse, another 2 for the wagon," he announced. Madeline's heart sank. She had no money. The outlaws had taken even the small savings she and Thomas had kept in a tin beneath their bed. Before she could speak, Gabriel was pressing coins into the liveryman's palm. "We'll need them well looked after," he said. "The ladies had a rough journey." "Ain't we all?" the old man grumbled, but he pocketed the money and began unhitching Samson from the wagon. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over, Mrs. Peterson's place. Tell her old Pete sent you. She might have a room." As they walked through Deadwood's bustling streets, Madeline felt exposed without the protective shell of her wagon. The town was predominantly male, and she drew appreciative and sometimes predatory glances from men unaccustomed to seeing a woman of her relatively young age and appearance. Gabriel walked slightly ahead of her, his posture alert and his hand never straying far from his weapon, creating a bubble of space that few seemed eager to penetrate. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house was a 2-story structure that, while plain, stood out for its cleanliness and air of respectability. A small sign in the window announced rooms to let respectable persons only. A stern-faced woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun opened the door at Gabriel's knock. Her sharp eyes assessed them quickly, lingering on Madeline's disheveled appearance. "We're looking for lodging for the lady," Gabriel explained. "Old Pete at the livery suggested your establishment. Mrs. Peterson's expression softened marginally. Did he now? Well, come in then before you bring half the street's dirt inside with you. She ushered them into a modest parlor. I have one room available, $2 a week, meals included. Madeline's heart sank again. Even if she found work immediately, how would she pay for lodging until she earned her first wages? Gabriel reached into his pocket and produced a small leather pouch. 3 weeks in advance, he said, counting out $6 onto Mrs. Peterson's palm. And perhaps a bath could be arranged for Mrs. Wright. She's had a difficult journey. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly at the title, her gaze shifting to Madeline's left hand, where a simple gold band, her wedding ring, still circled her finger. Of course, I'll have hot water brought up immediately. She turned to Madeline. You look like you could use a good meal as well. Thank you, Madeline managed, overwhelmed by Gabriel's generosity and the sudden kindness in the older woman's manner. You're very kind. Once Mrs. Peterson had shown them to a small but clean room on the second floor and departed to arrange for the bath, Madeline turned to Gabriel. I can't accept all this, she said. You've already done too much. Gabriel shook his head. Consider it an investment in your future enterprise. He placed the remaining contents of the leather pouch, several more dollars, and some loose change on the small table beside the bed. This should see you through until you can establish yourself. But how will I ever repay you? Fill that wagon again, he said simply. Build something new, that'll be repayment enough. He moved toward the door. I'll leave you to your bath and rest. Tomorrow we can discuss how to proceed with setting you up in business. You're not leaving? The question escaped before she could consider its implications. Gabriel paused, his hand on the doorknob. I'll take a room at the hotel down the street. Wouldn't be proper for me to stay here. Something in his expression softened. Don't worry, Mrs. Wright, I won't disappear on you just yet. After he left, Madeline sank onto the edge of the narrow bed, trying to process the whirlwind of changes in her circumstances. 3 days ago, she'd been a wife with a home and future. Now she was a widow in a strange town, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew. The bath, when it arrived, was the first real comfort she'd experienced since the raid on her homestead. Madeline sank into the warm water, allowing herself a moment of pure physical relief as the grime of travel and grief washed away. As she scrubbed her skin and hair clean, she found her thoughts returning to Gabriel North and his surprising story. He understood loss in a way few others could. Perhaps that was why he'd stopped for a woman sitting beside an empty wagon in the middle of nowhere. He'd recognized the hollow look of someone whose world had collapsed because he'd worn that same expression himself. Clean and dressed in her spare dress, wrinkled, but at least not covered in dust, Madeline made her way downstairs to the small dining room where Mrs. Peterson served meals to her boarders. The other residents, a middle-aged couple who operated the town's newspaper and 2 elderly sisters who taught at the newly established school, regarded her with polite curiosity but asked no probing questions, for which Madeline was grateful. The meal was simple but filling: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert, and Madeline realized how long it had been since she'd eaten properly. Mrs. Peterson, seeing her clean her plate, quietly brought her a second helping without comment. Thank you, Madeline said softly. It's been some time since I've had a home-cooked meal. Mrs. Peterson nodded. Your husband mentioned you've had a difficult journey. Madeline started to correct her assumption that Gabriel was her husband, then stopped. Perhaps it was simpler to allow the misunderstanding to stand for now. A widow traveling alone with a male companion who wasn't her husband would raise eyebrows even in a relatively lawless place like Deadwood. Yes, she said instead. We lost everything in a raid on our homestead. Mr. North has been kind enough to help me reach civilization. He seems a decent sort, Mrs. Peterson observed. Not like most who pass through here. She hesitated, then added, If you're in need of employment, Mrs. Wright, I could use help with the laundry and cooking. Nothing fancy, but it would provide you with some income beyond your room and board. Madeline felt a rush of gratitude. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Peterson. I would welcome the opportunity. Good, we'll start tomorrow. The older woman gathered Madeline's empty dishes. Rest well tonight. You look as though you could use it. Back in her room, Madeline stood by the window, gazing out at the rapidly darkening street below. Deadwood was transforming as night fell, its saloons and gambling halls lighting up like beacons while respectable establishments closed their doors. She could hear piano music drifting from somewhere nearby, accompanied by raucous laughter and occasional shouts. She thought of Gabriel in his hotel room, wondering if he was listening to the same sounds. Would he truly stay to help her establish herself, or would morning find him gone, continuing his journey north? The thought of facing this strange, overwhelming place alone sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. A soft knock at her door startled her from her reverie. When she opened it, Gabriel stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands and his hair damp, as if he too had recently bathed. "I wanted to ensure you were settled comfortably," he said, "and to discuss our plans for tomorrow if you're not too tired." Madeline stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. Propriety demanded she leave the door open, but something about Gabriel's presence made her feel more secure rather than threatened. "Mrs. Peterson has offered me employment helping with the laundry and cooking," she told him as he took the room's single chair, leaving her the bed to sit upon. "It's not much, but it's a start." Gabriel nodded approvingly. "That's good. Honest work with a respectable woman will help establish your reputation in town." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about your wagon. It's a good, solid vehicle, could serve as more than just transportation." "What do you mean?" "Many of the businesses here operate out of tents or hastily constructed lean toss," he explained. "A wagon could be converted into a mobile shop of sorts. You mentioned you can, so perhaps you could offer mending services or even create simple garments for the miners and others who come through." Madeline considered the idea. "I'd need supplies, fabric, thread, needles, and a sewing machine would make the work go faster. There's a general store that might carry what you need and a freight office that could order anything they don't stock." Gabriel's expression grew thoughtful. "The miners here are making good money and most have no women to care for their clothes. They'd pay well for quality work." For the first time since the raid, Madeline felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she could build something here, after all, not the cattle ranch she and Thomas had dreamed of, but a different kind of future. "I could start with mending," she said, working through the possibilities aloud. "Then perhaps expand to creating new garments as I establish myself, and eventually." "Eventually," Gabriel prompted when she trailed off. Madeline hesitated, almost embarrassed by the sudden vision that had formed in her mind. "Back home, I used to sew wedding dresses for the girls in our settlement. There was something special about creating a garment for the most important day in a woman's life." A smile touched Gabriel's lips. "Deadwood's a growing town. More women arrive every week, and where there are women, there will eventually be weddings." He stood, replacing his hat. "Tomorrow we'll visit the general store and see about those supplies. For tonight, you should rest." As he moved toward the door, Madeline found herself reluctant to see him leave. "Mr. North," she said quickly, "thank you, not just for the practical help, but for—" She struggled to find the right words. "For reminding me that an empty wagon can be filled again." Something in his gray eyes softened. "Good night, Mrs. Wright. I'll call for you in the morning." After he left, Madeline prepared for bed, her mind whirling with possibilities for her future that had seemed unimaginable just hours before. As she drifted toward sleep, she realized that for the first time since Thomas's death, she was thinking of tomorrow with anticipation rather than dread. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the previous day's heat. Madeline rose early, eager to begin the task of rebuilding her life. After a breakfast of porridge and coffee with the other boarders, she was ready when Gabriel arrived to escort her to the general store. Deadwood looked different in the morning light, still rough and unfinished, but bustling with purposeful activity. Freight wagons lumbered through the muddy streets, delivering supplies to the various businesses. Prospectors headed toward the surrounding hills, tools slung over their shoulders and determination etched on their faces. Women, fewer in number but no less industrious, carried baskets of laundry, trays of food, or children on their hips as they went about their daily tasks. "It's not so frightening in daylight," Madeline observed as they made their way through town. Gabriel offered a wry smile. "Deadwood puts on its best face in the morning. By evening, you'll see its true nature emerge again." He guided her toward a large wooden building with Swearengen's general merchandise, painted in bold letters across its front. Inside, the store was crammed with goods of every description: tools for mining and building, foodstuffs, clothing, housewares, and countless other items needed for frontier life. A bespectacled man with mutton chop whiskers stood behind the counter, eyeing them with keen interest as they entered. "Mr. Swearingen," Gabriel greeted him, "this is Mrs. Wright. She's looking to establish a dressmaking and mending business here in Deadwood." "Is that so?" Swearingen's gaze assessed Madeline with new interest. "We're short on such services here. Most of the ladies who arrive have other skills in mind." His tone made it clear what skills he meant. Madeline lifted her chin slightly. "I'm a skilled seamstress, Mr. Swearingen. I'm hoping to purchase the supplies I need to begin work immediately." "And what would those be, Mrs. Wright?" For the next hour, Madeline selected the essentials for her new enterprise: needles, thread in various colors, scissors, measuring tape patterns, and a modest selection of fabrics. Gabriel quietly added items she hesitated over, including a small hand-cranked sewing machine that cost more than all the other supplies combined. "That's too expensive," she protested in a whisper. "It will pay for itself in time saved," he countered. "And time is money in a place like this." When the final tally was calculated, Swearingen offered them a slight discount. "Consider it an investment in Deadwood's future," he said with a nod toward Madeline. "This town needs more respectable businesses if it's ever to amount to anything." As they left the store, their purchases to be delivered to Mrs. Peterson's boarding house later that day, Gabriel suggested they examine Madeline's wagon to determine what modifications would be needed to convert it into a mobile shop. The livery stable was cool and dim after the bright sunshine outside. Old Pete nodded to them as they entered, jerking a thumb toward the back where Madeline's wagon sat alongside several others. "She's sound enough," Gabriel said as he inspected the wagon carefully. "We could add a canopy for shade, and perhaps some shelving inside for your supplies and finished goods." He ran a hand along the wooden side. "With a fresh coat of paint and your name on the side, it would make a respectable business." "My name," Madeline echoed, suddenly struck by the reality of what they were planning. "Wright's dressmaking and mending." "Has a good ring to it," Gabriel agreed. He hesitated, then added, "I know a carpenter in town who could help with the modifications. Fellow named Jensen who owes me a favor." "You seem to know a lot of people for someone just passing through," Madeline observed. A shadow passed over Gabriel's face. "I've been through Deadwood before, on my way south last year." "After your wife and daughter died," Madeline said softly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on something distant. "I've been wandering since then, taking odd jobs, moving on when the memories catch up." He shook himself slightly, as if dispelling unwelcome thoughts. "Let's speak to Jensen this afternoon. With luck, your wagon could be ready for business within a few days." The carpenter, a taciturn Swede with enormous hands and few words, agreed to undertake the modifications to Madeline's wagon immediately. For a reasonable fee again paid by Gabriel despite Madeline's protests, he would add a folding canopy, built-in shelving, and even a small counter where customers could inspect her work. 3 days was all Jensen said when asked for a timeline. With the wagon's transformation underway, Madeline turned her attention to establishing her presence in Deadwood. She began work at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house that afternoon, helping with the laundry and preparation of the evening meal. The work was familiar and oddly comforting, a reminder that some skills remained valuable no matter where one found oneself. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Madeline would work at the boarding house in the mornings, then spend her afternoons preparing for her dressmaking business, organizing supplies, creating sample garments to display, and even sewing a simple banner with Wright's dressmaking and mending in bold lettering. Gabriel, true to his word, remained in Deadwood. He spent his days assisting Jensen with the wagon modifications, checking on Madeline's progress, and occasionally disappearing on mysterious errands of his own. Each evening, he would call at the boarding house to report on the wagon's transformation and discuss plans for the business. "Jensen says the wagon will be ready tomorrow," he announced on the evening of the 3rd day as they sat in Mrs. Peterson's parlor. The older woman had discreetly withdrawn to give them privacy, though she left the door conspicuously open. He's done a fine job, you'll hardly recognize it. I can't wait to see it, Madeline said, setting aside the shirt she was hemming her first paid commission from one of the newspaper couple's relatives visiting from Cheyenne, and to begin working properly. I've spoken to Marshal Bullock about where you might position your wagon, Gabriel continued. He suggests the corner near the hotel. It gets good foot traffic, but it's away from the saloons, so a respectable woman could operate there without too much bother. Madeline nodded, touched by his attention to such details. That sounds perfect. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been growing in her mind for days. How long will you stay in Deadwood, Mr. North? Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or uncertainty. I should continue north soon. Winter comes early in these parts, and I'd like to reach Montana Territory before the pass is close. Though she had expected this answer, Madeline felt a pang of dismay. In just a few days, Gabriel North had become her anchor in this strange new world, a friend, a mentor, and perhaps something more that she wasn't yet ready to name. Of course, she said, striving for a light tone. You've already delayed your journey far too long on my account. Gabriel studied her face for a long moment. I could stay another week, he said finally, to ensure your business is properly established. Relief washed over her. I would appreciate that greatly. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for the unveiling of Madeline's transformed wagon. Gabriel arrived at the boarding house early, his usual calm demeanor betraying a hint of excitement as he escorted her to the livery stable. Close your eyes, he instructed as they approached the stable doors. Madeline complied, allowing him to guide her forward by the elbow. She could hear old Pete chuckling somewhere nearby and the familiar sounds of horses in their stalls. All right, Gabriel said after a moment. You can look now. Madeline opened her eyes and gasped in delight. Before her stood her wagon, but so transformed that she would never have recognized it as the empty vehicle she had sat beside on the prairie. The wood gleamed with fresh paint, a deep forest green with cream trim. The promised canopy extended from one side, creating a shaded area where customers could stand. Inside, neatly constructed shelves lined the walls, ready to hold fabrics and finished garments. And across the back, in graceful gold lettering, was Wright's dressmaking and mending, quality work at fair prices. Oh, Gabriel, she breathed, using his first name without thinking. It's beautiful. His smile was warm with pleasure at her reaction. Jensen outdid himself. And I added the lettering myself, used to paint signs for a shipbuilder back in my seafaring days. Madeline circled the wagon, taking in every detail of its transformation. What had been a stark reminder of her losses was now a symbol of new beginnings, a vessel not for carrying possessions, but for building a future. I don't know how to thank you, she said, turning to find Gabriel watching her with an unreadable expression. Seeing you smile is thanks enough, he replied softly. Old Pete cleared his throat loudly, breaking the moment. If you two are done admiring the pretty wagon, I've got a horse ready to pull it to wherever you're planning to set up shop. By mid-morning, Madeline's wagon was positioned at the corner Gabriel had suggested, its canopy extended to create shade in the increasingly warm day. Inside, she had arranged her supplies and the few sample garments she had completed: a man's shirt, a child's dress, and some handkerchiefs with neatly embroidered initials. Now all you need are customers, Gabriel observed, standing back to admire the completed setup. I've had an idea about that, Madeline said. She reached into her pocket and withdrew several small cards she had carefully created the previous evening. I thought perhaps you might distribute these to some of the businesses in town to announce that Wright's dressmaking is open for business. Gabriel took the cards, examining the neat handwriting that detailed her services and location. Clever thinking, Mrs. Wright. I'll see these get into the right hands. While he set off on this mission, Madeline arranged and rearranged her small display, nervous energy making it difficult to be still. Would anyone come? Would the rough men of Deadwood have any interest in her services? How would she support herself if the business failed? Her worries were interrupted by a tentative voice. Excuse me, are you open for business? Madeline turned to find a young woman, perhaps a few years older than herself, standing beside the wagon. She wore a simple dress that had seen better days, its hem muddy and a small tear visible at one sleeve. "Yes, indeed I am," Madeline replied warmly. "How can I help you?" The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah Miller, wife of one of the assayers at the mining office, needed several garments mended and was delighted to find someone offering such services. As Madeline carefully noted the required repairs and quoted a fair price, a small crowd of curious onlookers began to gather. By the time Gabriel returned an hour later, Madeline had taken orders for mending from 6 different customers, and had even been commissioned to create a new shirt for a miner whose birthday celebration the previous night had resulted in his only good shirt being torn beyond repair. "Business appears to be booming," Gabriel observed, leaning against the wagon with an appreciative smile. "It's a promising start," Madeline agreed, trying to contain her excitement. "It seems there was indeed a need for my services in Deadwood. I suspected as much." Gabriel's expression grew thoughtful. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned that the young woman who plays piano at the Gem Saloon is getting married next month. Apparently, she's been fretting about finding a proper dress." Madeline felt a flutter of excitement. A wedding dress. "That would be a wonderful commission. I thought you might feel that way. I took the liberty of mentioning your skills to Mr. Swearingen, who owns the Gem. He said his piano player would call on you tomorrow." Gabriel grinned. "I hope that wasn't presumptuous." "Not at all." Madeline impulsively reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Gabriel, for everything." The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity. Word of Madeline's skills spread quickly through Deadwood, bringing a steady stream of customers to her wagon. Men brought shirts and trousers to be mended. Women came with dresses that needed alteration. And there were even orders for new garments, including, as Gabriel had promised, a commission for a wedding dress for the Gem Saloon's piano player, a sweet-faced girl named Lucy who was marrying a prospector who'd struck a modest but promising claim. Each evening, Gabriel would escort Madeline back to the boarding house after she closed her wagon for the day, listening attentively as she recounted the day's business and offering suggestions for expanding her services. Sometimes they would stop for a meal at the small cafe near the hotel, sharing quiet conversation as the raucous nightlife of Deadwood began around them. It was during one such dinner, 5 days after the wagon's unveiling, that Gabriel finally broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "I've received word that a freight wagon train is heading north to Montana Territory the day after tomorrow," he said, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup rather than her face. "It would be wise for me to join them. Traveling in numbers is safer, especially as winter approaches." Though she had been expecting this announcement, Madeline felt as if the air had been pulled from her lungs. She had known Gabriel would leave, had always known it, but somehow, in the busy days of establishing her business, she had allowed herself to forget that his presence in her life was temporary. "Of course," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "You've already delayed your journey far too long on my account. Your business is well established now," Gabriel continued. "You have regular customers, a good reputation, and Mrs. Peterson says you're welcome to stay at the boarding house as long as you wish." He finally met her gaze. "You'll do well here, Madeline." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the way he said it softly, almost reverently, made her heart constrict painfully. "Thanks to you," she said. "I don't know what would have become of me if you hadn't found me beside that empty wagon." Gabriel shook his head. "You would have found your way. You're stronger than you know." They walked back to the boarding house in silence, the weight of his imminent departure hanging between them like a physical presence. At the door, Gabriel paused, his hat in his hands and an unfamiliar uncertainty in his manner. "I'd like to call on you tomorrow evening, if I may," he said, "to say a proper goodbye." Madeline nodded, not trusting herself to speak without revealing the turmoil of emotions his words had unleashed. That night, sleep eluded her. Madeline lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room, thinking of all that had transpired in the short time since Gabriel North had ridden into her life. He had done far more than save her from certain death on the plains. He had helped her build a new future, one stitch at a time. And somewhere in the process, he had sewn himself into the fabric of her heart. The realization both startled and frightened her. It had been less than 2 weeks since Thomas's death. Surely it was too soon to feel such things for another man. And yet, as she examined her feelings in the quiet darkness, Madeline acknowledged that what she felt for Gabriel was entirely different from what she had felt for Thomas. Her marriage had been one of comfort and companionship, arranged by her father with a neighboring farmer's son whom she had known since childhood. She had cared for Thomas deeply and mourned his loss sincerely, but there had never been the kind of soul-deep connection she felt when Gabriel looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. Morning found her tired but resolved. Gabriel was leaving, continuing his journey to whatever awaited him in Montana Territory. She would thank him properly for his kindness, wish him well, and then focus on building the life he had helped her begin. It was the only sensible course of action. The day passed in a blur of customers and mending, Madeline's hands working steadily even as her mind wandered repeatedly to thoughts of the evening ahead. When the time came to close her wagon for the day, she found herself taking extra care with her appearance, washing her face and hands thoroughly, pinning her hair more neatly, and even adding a touch of rose water that Mrs. Peterson had kindly shared. Gabriel arrived at the boarding house precisely at 7, dressed in clean clothes with his hair still damp from a recent bath. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I thought we might walk a bit before dinner," he suggested. "There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, Madeline agreed, taking his proffered arm as they set off through Deadwood's evening streets. Rather than heading toward the busy center of town, Gabriel led her toward the outskirts, where the buildings thinned and gave way to the natural beauty of the surrounding hills. "It's not far," he assured her as they followed a narrow trail that wound upward through stands of pine trees. "Just over this rise." As they crested the hill, Madeline gasped in surprise. Before them lay a small clearing, and in its center stood a half-built cabin. The foundation and walls were complete, though the roof was only partially finished. A stream gurgled nearby, and wildflowers nodded in the gentle evening breeze. "What is this place?" she asked, turning to Gabriel in confusion. He gazed at the cabin, a mixture of pride and wistfulness in his expression. "I started building it last year during my previous pass through Deadwood." "I thought," he paused, seemed to gather his thoughts. "After wandering for so long following Sarah and Emma's deaths, I thought perhaps I was ready to stop somewhere, to try again." "But you didn't stay," Madeline said softly. Gabriel shook his head. "I wasn't ready then." The ghosts were still too close. He turned to face her fully. "I've continued working on it this past week while you were busy with your dressmaking. It helped me think." "Think about what?" Madeline asked, though something in her heart already knew the answer. "About whether I truly want to continue north." Gabriel's eyes held her steadily. "About whether there might be a reason to stay in Deadwood after all." Madeline's breath caught in her throat. "Gabriel," he held up a hand, "before you say anything, I know it's too soon. Your husband's passing is still fresh, and you're just beginning to rebuild your life." He gestured toward the cabin. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments, only that you consider the possibility of something more when you're ready." Tears pricked at Madeline's eyes, not of sadness but of a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't fully name. "I don't know what to say." Gabriel smiled gently. "You don't need to say anything now. I just wanted you to know why I built this place and why I might come back this way again." He extended the package he'd been carrying. "This is for you, something to remember me by if I do continue north tomorrow." With trembling fingers, Madeline untied the string and unwrapped the paper. Inside lay a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with intricate carvings of wildflowers around its edges. When she opened it, a soft melody began to play a music box. "It's the tune I was humming that first night by the fire," Gabriel explained. "A lullaby my wife used to sing to our daughter." It seemed fitting somehow. Madeline closed the box gently, clutching it to her chest as tears spilled freely now. "It's beautiful, thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the whisper of the wind through the pines and the distant murmur of the stream. Then, gathering her courage, Madeline spoke the words that had been forming in her heart all day. "I don't want you to go," she said simply. Gabriel's expression softened. "Are you sure, Madeline? You've barely had time to grieve, to adjust to your new circumstances." "I'm not sure of anything except that when I think of you leaving tomorrow, it feels like losing everything all over again." She took a step closer to him. I know it's too soon to make promises or commitments, as you said, but I also know that what I feel for you is real and true, even if it's new." Gabriel's hands came up to gently frame her face. "I've been wandering for 3 years, trying to outrun my grief, but from the moment I saw you beside that empty wagon, something changed. It was as if a voice inside me said, 'This is where you stop running.'" Madeline leaned into his touch. "Then stay and finish your cabin, stay and see what might grow between us given time and patience." "And your business?" Gabriel asked. "You've built something remarkable already." A smile touched Madeline's lips. "A wagon can move, you know." "I could set up closer to your cabin once it's finished. Wright's dressmaking would simply relocate to the edge of town." Gabriel laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the clearing. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "Not everything," she replied softly, "but enough to know that I want you to stay." As the sun began to set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the half-built cabin, Gabriel North drew Madeline right into his arms. Their kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a passion, a beginning rather than an ending. "When I found you beside that empty wagon," he murmured against her hair, "I told you that you'd fill it again with what you love." Madeline looked up at him, her heart full of a happiness she had never expected to find in this rough frontier town. "And so I have," she whispered. "So I have." Over the weeks and months that followed, Gabriel and Madeline built their lives together with the same care and patience with which they completed the cabin in the clearing. Gabriel officially abandoned his plans to continue north, instead taking work with the mining company as a security consultant, using his experience from his wandering years to help protect the gold shipments that regularly left Deadwood. Madeline's business thrived, expanding from simple mending to include dressmaking for many of Deadwood's growing female population. After Lucy's wedding, where her handcrafted gown drew admiration from everyone present, orders for special occasion clothing increased dramatically. By winter, she had hired a young assistant, the daughter of one of the miners, who showed a natural talent with needle and thread. As Gabriel had suggested, Madeline eventually relocated her wagon shop to the edge of town near their cabin. The move proved advantageous away from the busiest streets. She could work in greater peace, and customers seemed to enjoy the short walk through the pines to reach her. On pleasant days, she would set up her sewing machine on the small porch Gabriel had added to the cabin, working in the sunshine as birds sang in the surrounding trees. Their courtship progressed at a measured pace, respecting Madeline's need to fully process her grief for Thomas while exploring her growing feelings for Gabriel. They took supper together most evenings, sometimes joined by friends they had made in town. Mrs. Peterson, who had become something of a mother figure to Madeline, Jensen the carpenter and his wife, and even Marshall Bullock and his family on occasion. As winter blanketed Deadwood in snow, Gabriel formally asked for Madeline's hand in marriage. It was a quiet proposal, offered one evening as they sat before the fire in the now completed cabin, sharing stories of their childhoods and dreams for the future. "I know it's still soon," he said, taking her hand in his, "and I'll wait as long as you need. But I want you to know that my heart is yours entirely, Madeline Wright. When you're ready, I'd be honored to make you my wife." Madeline, who had been anticipating this moment for weeks, surprised him with her ready answer. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm ready now, Gabriel. I don't want to wait any longer." They were married on Christmas Day, 1876, in a ceremony at the small church that had recently been built in Deadwood. Madeline wore a gown of her own creation, ivory silk with delicate embroidery that had taken her weeks to complete. Gabriel, standing tall and handsome in a new suit, watched her walk down the aisle with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears of joy. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," he whispered as she reached his side. "Thank you for proving me wrong." Their wedding reception, held at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, was attended by what seemed like half the town, a testament to how quickly they had both become valued members of the community. There was music and dancing, food and drink in abundance, and an atmosphere of celebration that continued well into the evening. As they prepared to leave for their cabin, now their shared home, old Pete from the livery appeared with a surprise. Madeline's wagon, decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbons, with Samson hitched and ready to take them home through the snowy streets. Seemed fitting, the old man said gruffly. Seeing as how it all started with an empty wagon, Gabriel helped Madeline up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the boarding house, the sound of cheers and well wishes following them into the night, he turned to his bride with a smile. "No longer empty," he said, nodding toward the wagon bed behind them, which was filled with wedding gifts from their friends and neighbors. "Just like your life, just like mine." Madeline leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she sat beside her empty wagon on the Dakota plain. "We've filled it with what we love," she said softly. "Each other and the life we're building together." Gabriel pressed a kiss to her forehead as Samson carried them through the quiet, snow-covered streets toward home. "And we're only just beginning," he promised. Spring arrived in the Black Hills with a riot of wildflowers and new growth, nature's reminder that even the harshest winters eventually give way to renewal. For Gabriel and Madeline North, the changing of the seasons marked nearly 4 months of marriage, months filled with the simple joys of building a life together, adjusting to each other's habits and preferences, and planning for their future. Their cabin, once a solitary structure on the outskirts of town, was now the heart of a small but thriving community. Jensen the carpenter had built his own home nearby, followed by the newspaper couple from Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, who had decided that the edge of town offered a more peaceful environment for writing and printing. Madeline's dressmaking business continued to flourish, with her wagon shop becoming something of a social center for the women of Deadwood, who came as much for conversation and companionship as for her skilled needlework. Gabriel had been promoted to head of security for the mining company, a position that kept him busy but allowed him to be home most evenings. He had also begun building furniture in his spare time, discovering a talent for craftsmanship that complemented Madeline's own creative abilities. Their cabin was gradually filling with pieces. He had made a rocking chair for the porch, a desk where Madeline could sketch her designs, a hope chest at the foot of their bed. It was in early April, as the last patches of snow melted in the shadowed hollows of the hills, that Madeline shared news that would change their lives once again. "I believe we'll need to add a cradle to your list of projects," she told Gabriel one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. For a moment, he didn't seem to understand her meaning. Then comprehension dawned, and his face transformed with wonder and joy. "A baby, we're having a baby," Madeline nodded, her own happiness mirrored in his expression. "Come autumn, if all goes well." Gabriel knelt before her chair, laying his head gently against her still flat stomach. "A family," he whispered. "Our family." As summer progressed and Madeline's condition became more apparent, Gabriel grew increasingly protective, insisting that she reduce her working hours and hire additional help for the busier days. Though she protested that pregnancy was not an illness, she secretly appreciated his concern and the opportunity to focus on preparing for their child's arrival. They converted the small second bedroom of their cabin into a nursery, Gabriel crafting not only a cradle but also a changing table and a small chest for the baby's clothes. Madeline sewed tiny garments in the evenings, her skilled fingers creating delicate gowns and blankets, while Gabriel read aloud from books they had ordered from back east. "What shall we name him?" Gabriel asked one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over the swell of her abdomen. "Or her," he added quickly. Madeline considered for a moment. "If it's a boy, perhaps Thomas, after my first husband." She glanced at Gabriel uncertainly. "Would that be too strange?" Gabriel shook his head. "It would be a fitting tribute to a good man who was taken too soon. Thomas North has a strong sound to it." "And if it's a girl," Madeline prompted. A sad smile touched Gabriel's lips. "I'd like to honor my daughter, but perhaps not with her exact name." "Emma brings too many memories." "What about Sarah?" Madeline suggested gently. "After your first wife, or we could combine them somehow, Sarah Emma or Emma Sarah." Gabriel's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "You wouldn't mind naming our child after my past?" Madeline took his hand and placed it where the baby was kicking energetically. "Our past shapes us, Gabriel. Without Sarah and Emma, without Thomas, we wouldn't be who we are today, wouldn't have found each other. It seems right to honor them in our future." He kissed her then, a tender expression of love and gratitude that needed no words. As autumn approached and the hills began to don their golden mantle, Deadwood prepared for its second anniversary as a settlement. Despite its rough beginnings, the town was gradually developing a sense of permanence and community. A proper school had been established, additional churches were being built, and there was even talk of constructing a real theater. For Madeline, now in the final weeks of her pregnancy, these developments reinforced her belief that they had made the right decision in making Deadwood their home. Despite its continuing reputation for lawlessness in some quarters, the town was growing into a place where a child could thrive. "We'll need to think about schooling eventually," she remarked to Gabriel as he massaged her swollen feet one evening. "And perhaps music lessons. I always wished I'd learned to play an instrument." Gabriel smiled at her long-term planning. "Let's get through the birth first, shall we? Then we can worry about educational opportunities for the next 20 years. The labor began on a crisp October morning as the first snowflakes of the season drifted past their windows. Mrs. Peterson, who had attended many births during her long life, came to assist, along with the town's newly arrived doctor, a young man fresh from medical school in Philadelphia. For 16 hours, Gabriel paced the cabin's main room, wincing at every cry from the bedroom where Madeline labored to bring their child into the world. Jensen kept him company for part of the time, offering quiet support and occasional sips from a flask of whiskey to steady his nerves. "Hardest thing a man can do," Jensen observed, standing by, unable to help while his woman suffers. Gabriel nodded grimly. "I'd take her pain if I could. That's love," the carpenter said simply, "real love." Just as the sun was setting, a new cry filled the cabin, the indignant wail of a baby taking its first breath. Gabriel froze mid-pace, his heart pounding as he stared at the bedroom door. When it finally opened, Mrs. Peterson emerged with a small bundle wrapped in one of Madeline's handmade blankets. "Congratulations, Mr. North," she said, her usually stern face softened with a smile. "You have a daughter, a beautiful, healthy girl." Gabriel took the tiny bundle with trembling hands, peering down at the red, wrinkled face of his newborn child. She had a dusting of dark hair like his, not Madeline's chestnut locks, and when she opened her eyes briefly, he glimpsed a blue-gray color that might eventually match his own. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I've been waiting to meet you." "Your wife is asking for you," Mrs. Peterson added. "She did wonderfully, strong as they come." Gabriel found Madeline propped up against their pillows, her face pale but radiant with exhaustion and joy. The young doctor was packing his bag, offering quiet instructions about rest and recovery that Gabriel barely registered as he carried their daughter to her mother's side. "She's perfect," Madeline said as Gabriel carefully transferred the baby to her arms. "Our Sarah Emma North." Gabriel sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Madeline's shoulders and the other hand gently stroking his daughter's cheek. "Thank you," he murmured against Madeline's hair, "for her, for everything." As winter settled over the Black Hills once more, the North family established new routines centered around their infant daughter. Madeline temporarily closed her dressmaking business, focusing instead on motherhood and gradually completing only the most important commissions from home. Gabriel adjusted his work schedule to spend more time at the cabin, unwilling to miss a moment of Sarah Emma's rapid development. Their first Christmas as a family was a quiet but joyous affair. They invited Mrs. Peterson, Jensen and his wife, and a few other close friends for a modest feast. Gabriel had built a small wooden horse for Sarah Emma. "Her first Christmas deserves a gift, even if she's too young to know it," he insisted, and Madeline had sewn matching stockings for the three of them to hang by the fireplace. As they prepared for bed that night, after their guests had departed, and Sarah Emma was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Madeline found Gabriel standing by the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of snow-covered pines. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she asked, slipping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. "About how much can change in a year," he replied, turning to draw her into his embrace. "Last Christmas we were just married. The Christmas before I was alone, still wandering, still lost." He glanced toward the cradle where their daughter slept. "And now look at us. A home. A family. A filled wagon, Madeline added with a smile. Gabriel laughed softly. Indeed, filled to overflowing with everything I never dared to hope for again. As they stood together in the warm glow of their home, snow falling gently outside, Madeline reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from an empty wagon on the Dakota plain to a life rich with love, purpose, and promise. What had begun with loss and despair had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its capacity to begin anew. "I love you, Gabriel North," she whispered. "Thank you for stopping that day, for seeing possibility where I saw only emptiness." His answer was a kiss, tender and full of promise for all the years to come, years they would fill together with everything they loved.